Good to have you with us again. Romans 13, 8 through 10 resumes Paul's previous details about Christian love being a demonstration of a transformed mind. These verses also anticipate the apostles' challenge in chapters 14 and 15 for the Christians in Rome to love each other. In Romans 13, 8 through 10, Paul used the verb agapao and the noun agape a total of 5 times in 3 verses. Neither word denotes sexual attraction or feelings. That word would be eros, which is not found in the New Testament. The verb agapao does not mean to have only affection and warm feelings for others, but to have a high regard for them and to take an interest in their affairs. Loving fellow Christians is an important way of showing that our minds have been transformed and is a key test since not everyone is lovable. The Christian who loves not only demonstrates how in Christ they are changed, but also the kind of affection toward fellow Christians which fulfills, Paul said, the other law. The other law he speaks of may be the 10 Commandments, since the following quotes found in verse 9 come from them. It was probably revolutionary for some in the Roman church to hear that Christians could fulfill the law by loving others. This message may have been especially directed to the Judaizing Christians in Rome. From what we know, they emphasized observing certain Jewish practices of the law, such as food regulations and observing special days. Paul's position was that these were peripheral matters and not central to the Christian belief, but showing love to the brethren and others was. That was the essence of the law as Paul saw it. The apostle listed in Romans 13:9 several items from the 10 Commandments, such as its prohibiting adultery, murder, stealing, and coveting. While very important, he said these commands and all others in God's word are summed up in the charge to love one another, and especially one's neighbor. The quote from Leviticus 19:18 anchors his case. Some Jews at Qumran and others understood neighbor to mean only fellow Israelites. However, Paul and Jesus gave it a broader interpretation. Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan clearly illustrates that point. James Dunn noted that several rabbis held views very much like Paul's about love fulfilling the law. Hillel gave the negative form of the golden rule in summing up the law. And he said, that which you hate, do not do to your fellows. This is the whole law. The rest is commentary. Go and learn it. Also remarkable is the commentary of Rabbi Akiba on Leviticus 19:18, that it was, he said, the greatest general principle in the Torah. Later, Rabbi Simlai argued that Amos and Habakkuk had each reduced the entire law to one simple statement. For example, Amos in Amos 5:4, referring to God, said, seek me and live. And Habakkuk stated, the righteous man lives by his faith. Hillel and others saw the command to love your neighbor as one that derives from the law but does not replace the law. To the contrary, Paul saw love as so much the basis of the law and so totally woven into its fabric that it was a replacement for the entire system of law. For Jews, the love command would certainly preclude defrauding someone or not doing bodily harm, but they could never see love replacing such doctrines as the Sabbath and circumcision. Paul's response would be that observing the works of the law prevented the principle of love from reaching its fullest expression. When Paul said in Romans 13:8, we are not to owe any man anything, this must not be taken out of context that he was saying, well, it's wrong to buy a house, car, or other items on credit. Instead, Paul was talking about owing a brother or sister in the Lord nothing but love. The debt of love is one that we can never fully pay off and is one we keep on owing day by day. Origen, the great scholar of the early church, said, the debt of love remains with us permanently and never leaves us. This is a debt which we both discharge every day and forever owe. Paul seems to be saying that we automatically keep the law if we practice paying off the debt of love. Now, this means if we follow the practice of love, we will not commit adultery. Since in real love, there is commitment, devotion, and discipline. If we follow the way of love, we will not kill another person, but will make efforts to turn that enemy into a friend. If the way of love is followed, we will not steal from others or covet what they have. One famous saying is, love God and do what you like. This means that if love is at the core of who we are and we walk by it every day, we will do what God likes and we will do what he wants us to do. We will need no other law, as Paul says, because genuinely holding to love makes all other laws unnecessary.
Okay, we should stop right there. That's a lesson in itself for sure, but it gives us an opportunity to have some good discussion on this topic that Paul writes about, and very practical to us. And we're going to see more of this practicality of loving as we get into chapters 14 and 15, talking about don't cause your brother to stumble. We're going to get into some issues there that again come back to a theme of love that Paul's going to address for us, which will be, I think, a really interesting study for us as well as we move forward. And I like that statement that he makes, and we're going to see how that comes into play, that he made, love God and do what you like. Is that aspect of it. If we really comprehend what this agape love is, and that if we truly love God, then we can do what we like, because if love motivates us, we're going to see, as Paul talks about, then we're not going to do all these other things that the law condemns. So that's the really transforming aspect about love that Paul's going to talk about. So we'll look at as we get into chapter 13, look at the first verse there in verse 8. Anthony, can you advance that for me? I'm stuck. The Romans 13:8 is where we pick up this morning, and it's going to tie back to Romans chapter verse 7, as we'll see here. Thank you. Owe nothing to anyone except to love one another, for he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. Now, if you remember, as we finished last week in discussing relationship to the government, Paul had finished his discussion with that passage, verse 7, render to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. And we went back and referred to when Jesus was given the coin, and he was questioned about paying taxes, and rendered to Caesar things that are Caesar. We talked about that, the responsibility to obey the government and to pay taxes that are due. Paul ends with that, and in verse 7 and 8 have connection. It said that the two of the words that's used there in the original language, do them and owe, are kind of connected. So it's like Paul finishes chapter 7 to where you pay your debts, you pay the taxes that you owe, and then he goes into the very next verse we're looking at today when he's going to shift to this idea of love. So you're going to pay your taxes, but then owe nothing to anyone. Here's what the other debt that you have that you need to pay. So you pay your taxes, but then he goes into verse 8, but here's another debt you owe that you need to continue to pay. Now, Dr. Pollard's already mentioned that it's not talking about buying stuff on credit. And I'm thankful for that. After 33 years of banking, I helped a lot of people go in debt. And not everybody repaid them either, I must say, but that was the hard part of it about that. But yeah, he's not talking about that. He's not talking about taking on personal debt. We have other passages that tell us, you can borrow, but you must pay back. But his aspect there, he's talking about this debt of love that we owe. He says he's given us that indication that we have this obligation, owe nothing to anyone except to love one another. And do not fail to pay what you owe, that we owe this debt. Love is a debt. It's one of those debts. It's probably the only debt that you can never repay. And that's what Paul's given us an indication of. You can never repay this debt. We're going to see in other passages that he's going to refer to that to us as we look at. Someone has said this, or Stuart Briscoe in his commentary on Romans makes this comment: love seems to reside in people's minds as something between a noble idea and a pleasant optional extra. The apostle, referring to Paul, the apostle insists, however, that love is an obligation as real as taxation and personal debt repayment. So Paul's telling us this is an obligation. So here's the question. Why do we owe it to love others? Okay, what we're told to do, would you say, Dean?
Christ loved us.
Christ loves us. Yeah, we're told in the Bible, it reveals to the Bible how much God loved us. 1 John 4:11, beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. Okay, so, Oben?
Would it also to pay God for allowing his son to go to the cross for sin that we committed?
Exactly. And so it's an obligation that we can never repay. So we continue to go on loving because Christ's love is superior to our love. So we can never repay that debt, can we, Oben? So that's why it's a debt we can't repay, because God's love, Christ's love, is superior to ours. So we need to be mindful of that, and we try to repay that by loving others is how we respond to that. Paul?
You know, going along with all this, we also, if you want to get love, you got to give.
Okay.
You
Yeah.
can't expect people to love you if you don't love them.
If you don't treat them right. Yeah, exactly. Bill?
If you love anybody, you won't do them any harm, do you?
Exactly. And that's really the essence of what Paul's going to continue to say. If you love someone, you're not going to commit these wrongs against them. And that's the idea of fulfilling the law if we truly love. Now, the interesting thing about the agape love, it's not, and Dr. Pollard referred to it, phileo love is the love that's used in the New Testament that has to do with feelings, you know, a warm feeling towards someone. Agape love, it's not about how we feel about somebody. It's not about feelings. It's a decision that we're going to care about them. And you mentioned, you may have heard him mention at the beginning that some people aren't lovable. Now, could we agree with that? Some people are hard to love. But when agape comes in, you still care for them. It's not about a warm, fuzzy feeling. And we know some people, we don't get a warm, fuzzy feeling around. This idea of agape says you love them because of this obligation you have to love others. He's going to talk about our neighbors here in a second, which includes everyone. But it's because you made a decision that you're going to care about them. You're going to put them before you. And that's the real transforming power Paul talks about, you know, in Romans 12:1. This is about a transformation. These aren't easy things, and it's contrary to what the society might tell us. And that's why Paul says we need to transform and not conform to the world. This is a transformational thing as Christians he's talking about, to try to respond in this kind of love and know that it's a debt. And we should understand that it's a debt because of what God's done for us. And again, it's a debt that we can't repay. Now, other thoughts or comments on that? Open?
And Frank and I, when we were doing communion out in Mitchell Manor, first time I ever seen it happen in my lifetime. We'd go by, you know, and the patients was in there, and there'd be symbol there in the lobby room. We'd walk by and say, God bless you. God bless you. Never had it ever failed, no matter what condition it's in. We went in there one Sunday and they had a new lady had come in, and boy, she was all dressed up, had jewelry and everything. And so and I walked by and I said, well, God bless you. She said, I don't need your God, I got my own. She did. She had rings all over her hands.
Wow. Wow.
Frank looked. First time in my life ever had it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Got her own.
Well, that might be one of those people that didn't come across so lovable to you, but you cared for them anyway, don't you?
Yeah, I didn't go back for the second.
Not warm and fuzzy. Yeah. But we care about those folks. But yeah. And that's the kind of people we live in a world, and that's where the challenges come in. Those who live contrary to what we understand and the principles of God, but we love them. And that's the aspect we're going to see. Yeah, Linda.
Think about it. This is to love one another is second only to the greatest command to love God.
Exactly. And we're going to look at that. We're going to look at how that fits together. As you heard Glenda, it's second only to the command to love God. We're going to look at that passage. Look at the second part of Romans 13:8. The second part of that, Paul gives a reason why it's so important to love one another. And I underline this part that we'll talk about because we saw, owe nothing to anyone except to love one another, that debt we can't repay. For he who loves his neighbor has fulfilled the law. Now, you think about that. We've talked about Paul's discussion here in Romans dealing with the Jewish world, the Jews and the Gentiles. And what did they hold? What did the Jews hold as very important in their lives? They're God's people, but they held the law. Yeah, the law was a part of it, wasn't it, John? So think about Paul saying this to them, saying, if you love this way, you fulfill the law. And obviously, a lot of your translations don't have L in the capital L, which we've talked about how that's how commentators try to let you know that that's probably talking about the O law, or if it has the in front of it, which this translation does in American Standard, the law. If it has the article in front of it, it's usually referring to the old O law, the commandments. And we know from the context here, that's what he's referring to, because he's going to quote some of those 10 commandments here in his next reference. So we know Paul's referring to the old law that God's lined out. So you can imagine the reaction that the Jews might have that are still trying to hold on to the law. And that's part of what Paul's been talking about. But he's letting them know that, you know what really fulfills this law is loving your neighbor. And we'll see how that falls in there. And they had a concept about a neighbor that Jesus came to change their mindset about who their neighbor was. In Jesus' teaching, who do we understand our neighbor is? Everybody. Anybody who's in need. We see that that was the very essence of the Good Samaritan, that anyone who's in need, and we see that relationship established there. Now, we'll get into the next passages when he's going to talk about the 10 Commandments here, or some of the 10 Commandments. 10 Commandments are found in Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5, as you know, and they're divided into two parts. First 4 deal with our relationship with God, which Glenda's mentioned, and the last 6 deal with our relationship with others. Now, I don't always remember, I'm sure you don't remember, it's been quite a few years. We had a study here on Sunday mornings where we studied the contemporary value of the 10 Commandments in our lives, how these principles are carried forth in the New Testament. And we did an intensive study on each of these in relation to Jesus' teachings, except for remember the Sabbath. Now, the day we come together is the first day of the week, but there's principles from the Sabbath that are good to remember. We did an extensive study about that, which I think a really interesting study because there's such value in that. But when God presented the 10 Commandments, the first 4 were about what's called, and I referenced Harold Shank on here, who's a Old Testament scholar. He wrote a book, Listening to His Heartbeat, referring to God. There's a great study on God's attributes. He's the first one that I saw that I've read that's put it in this way, to vertical and horizontal, that the first 4 commandments are vertical, okay? They're to God. They're about the divine human relationship. Have no other gods, fashion no image of God, make proper use of the divine name, not take God's name in vain, and remember the Sabbath. Those are the first 4 commandments. That's our relationship with God. And when God set his law out, is the first thing to do is to establish our relationship with our Heavenly Father. That's the first thing he did when he presented the law. You've got to get this right, okay? And Glenna mentioned, got to love God, okay? That's our first and foremost. We'll look again at Jesus' statement when he's asked about what is the greatest commandment. We got to love God first. We got to get that right. And then the remaining 6 commandments, as you see, are horizontal, is our relationship with human community, with one another. And that's what those 6 commandments are referring to. So Paul is going to refer to 4 of those in his reference and what he's going to say in the next next passage. So let's look at verse 9 of chapter 13. So Paul's going to go back to those 10 commandments, those commandments that have to do with our relationship with one another. And he says, for this, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not murder, you shall not steal, you shall not covet. And if there is any other commandment, it is summed up in this saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Okay. So Paul is choosing those commandments because those are typically a listing of moral obligations. It's recognized by most individuals who are concerned about living a godly life. But he says, but any other commandment is included in this as well. But he specifically mentions those moral obligations that are definitely fulfilled through the law. And so he concentrates on that. So look at what Jesus said. And Glenda made reference to this, and I think it's important for us to look at. Jesus was asked, the Pharisee, who was also a lawyer, asked Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? Now, and again, as we're studying the context of the Jewish mindset, this question is really interesting from a Jewish mindset because the Jewish rabbis had identified 613 different commandments. Okay, so think about this. When this Jew asked Jesus this question, they've identified 613 different commandments, and they're always having a discussion. Now, in those 613 commandments they'd identified, 248 were called positive commands, and 365 were things not to do, prohibitions. So they had a lot of commands, and they continued to debate about which they thought was most important to keep and which they thought were not as important to keep. So we've seen those issues and statements go about the heavy and the least, and Jesus is going to give that discussion in Matthew 23. Right after this, Jesus is going to condemn the Pharisees for their teachings. And it's interesting, it falls right after, in Matthew, it falls right after this discussion. So here, they've got all these commandments, and obviously, they're asking Jesus this question. They're always trying to trap Jesus. They think they can handle Jesus' discussion about the greatest commandments because they're so learned, and they're hoping to, anytime they ask him a question, that they're going to be able to handle it in a way that's going to discredit Jesus, okay, which they never can. But that's the purpose of this discussion. This has gone on with their teachers, and they think they can trap Jesus some way, and they can come out looking better than Jesus. They can come out looking smarter than Jesus within the law. But again, obviously, Jesus always has the answer that silences them. So Jesus makes the response when they say, which is the greatest commandment? He says to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. And this is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Paul's quoting basically what Jesus said here in Romans chapter 13 about loving your neighbor as yourself. This law goes way back. It's interesting that God's intent is always love. We think about the Old Testament, New Testament, love is just prevalent throughout. We see God's response to evil in the Old Testament. We see the principles of God are the same. Love is just as important. Jesus goes back to the law, and it's what they were given in Deuteronomy 6:4-5. It's the Jews called the Shema. Shema is a Hebrew word for hear, and they would repeat this a couple of times a day, maybe 3 times a day. Seen it said differently, that they would repeat this prayer. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And here's the commandment. The Shema is that first verse, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. That's what they would repeat, the Shema. And Orthodox Jews still repeat that to this day. Here's the command. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Okay? So the first aspect of that is loving God with all we have. And so that aspect of it, when we get a relationship with God right, then we understand our obligation to others, Oben, as we talked about. When we get this relationship with God right and we love God right, then we are going to love our fellow man right, because we understand this obligation that we have because of what God's done for us. And our obligation to repay that is to love others and continue to love others. Because we can't outlove God, and we have this obligation of how we've been loved. We share that love, like Paul said. You love others, and more likely we don't do it to get them to reciprocate their love, do we, Paul? But you're going to be more likely to get that reaction when we show others that we truly love them, and that's where we have an opportunity to share the message of the gospel. How do we have this kind of love? Well, let me share that with you. This is because of Jesus, because of what what God did by giving his son. He loved us so much that he went to the cross for us. And when we understand that obligation, again, it helps us to love others the way we should. Thoughts or comments on that? You can never match God's love. That's not even close. Yeah, John. And that's why his love will always superior to our love. And again, that's why it's a debt we can never repay, can we? You know. Yeah. And that's, again, that's why God's love is agape love. When we talk about God so loved the world, it's agape love, is that you choose to love others, not because of what they've done for you or whether you have a warm feeling about them or not. You just choose to love them because you do. And it's an obligation that we care for them. And again, the idea of neighbor is anyone who's in need, as Jesus had explained for us in the parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10. And so you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Now, this idea of loving self just has the idea of most people want to care for themselves, don't we? I mean, we want to take care of ourselves. We want to make sure we have food, clothing, and shelter. We're going to be inclined to take care of ourselves. And that's what he's referring to there. You know, we want, and we care for ourselves. So we need to care for others just like we would care for ourselves. But
He says the second is like the first, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. He could have repeated the whole thing. He said, you shall love your neighbor with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, because that's how we love ourselves.
that's a good point.
I think that's the reason we put that at the beginning, because he wants us to love God just like we can love ourselves. He wants with our whole being.
With your whole
He
being.
wants us to love our neighbor with our whole
Mhm.
being.
Yeah, that's a great point Glenn is talking about. He wants us to love our neighbor just like we love God with our whole being, with our heart, mind, soul, and strength. Mark adds that extra word in the conversation he records with Jesus and the lawyer. Mike?
The old saying, no good deed goes unpunished. So don't be surprised if some folks that don't love you back. Look what Christ loved everybody. They killed him.
Yeah.
So we just don't get discouraged, I guess, trying to love people, but it's not as easy as we make it sound.
Yeah. You know, like I said, the very great point and the very characteristic of God's love, you know, the passage everybody knows, John 3:16, for God so loved the world. Who's the world? It's everybody, wasn't it? It wasn't the globe. It's everybody. Well, was everybody lovable? Was everybody on God's side? No. But that's what's the amazing thing that Paul wrote about in Romans 5:8. While we were yet sinners, he sent his son to die for us. You know, that's what's even more incredible. That's the incredible nature of God's love that we need to try to grasp, because yeah, they didn't love him back. Like Mike said, they didn't love him back. Did I see another hand? Owen?
I've heard a lot of people say, well, I don't deserve God's love. That's a pretty negative statement, isn't it?
And none of us deserve God's love.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. We've all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. None of us deserve his love, so they're right there. Yeah. And when God sent his son, the world didn't deserve his son. But you're right. That is a true statement. We don't deserve his love. And we just got to encourage him. I don't either. But, you know, he loves me, and he's provided a way for me to receive forgiveness and because of the sacrifice of his son. But yeah, that's a great point. None of us deserve it. And that's why this is a debt we can't repay. You know, it's a debt, this love debt we continue to love because we can't repay that debt. Let's see another hand. Yeah, Raymond?
Forgiveness falls right along with that too. You know, if you want love, you got to give love. If you want forgiveness, you got to give forgiveness.
Great point.
Those there work right side by side.
Hand in hand, doesn't it, Raymond? Exactly. Exactly. That's a great point. Goes hand in hand, that forgiveness. And we see that too, right? Larry?
I always have a problem with loving somebody that I don't like. He didn't say I had to like them. And God loves us, but sometimes we do things and he doesn't like it. But he still loves us and he forgives us. And that's a hard part for me to do, is to love somebody that I don't like.
Great point. That's a really great point, Larry. Yeah. So we've talked about praying for your enemies and things like that. Yeah. But like Larry said, that's the hard challenge for all of us. is loving somebody we really don't like, and that's that agape love that comes in. So yeah, great examples. That's a real challenge for us. Other thoughts or comments?
Andy,
Yeah, Owen.
We may not agree with the way they do, but we've got to love the person. And we can hate sin, but we can't hate the person.
Exactly.
Love the person and
Yeah.
hate
Yeah, sin, Satan and sin's taken over their life. We got to love the person, hope they can come out of that. Exactly. So, yeah, great point. And that's an aspect we have to look at. But yeah, like Larry mentioned, even Dr. Pollard, as I said before, some people don't come across that lovable, and that's the challenge we have to still love those folks. They're still considered our neighbors by Jesus, and we have an obligation to love. So Jesus, I threw this in here at the end of that conversation with the lawyer. Jesus goes on and says, which will be similar to what we're going to see Paul say, on these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. Now, that's an incredible statement. Jesus is laying the groundwork for what the apostles are going to continue to teach, because these concepts are really, I don't want to say revolutionary, but in their way of thinking with the Jews, the things that Jesus are saying that this can fulfill the whole law and the prophets. I mean, and the idea, that word for depend, I think it holds the idea, it can be translated as hang, as a door hangs on the hinges. So the whole Old Testament hangs on these two commandments. So that's a powerful statement. Loving God, you have God in focus, as the first four commandments showed. When you have this right, then you're going to love people the right way, the other six commandments, and that fulfills the whole Old Testament. And then we see it fulfilled. We get to see it fulfilled in his own son coming to earth, and we get to see what it looks like. Think about that. We get to see what it looks like to love everyone. And Jesus, God sent his son in human flesh to show us what this looks like. And it fulfills the law. So it's a pretty incredible statement for Jesus to make, as strongly as they hold to the law and the prophets, trying to keep everything right. And then Paul spent a lot of time in Romans, talked about, keeping the law will not make you right with God. Keeping this old law, we've talked about it. You're not under law, you're under grace, and we've done extensive discussion on that. Mike.
I think the Pharisees may have made it pretty hard for the people to show any love to them because of all the things that they
Exactly.
all the things that the law added to it.
Yeah. And Jesus is telling them to love your enemies, and the Pharisees didn't come across very lovable to them. And that's what he's going to say. After chapter 22, in your own time, you might go now and read chapter 23, the woes to the Pharisees. Talk about all the things you're requiring them to do that you don't do. And you're straining, what you're straining at a gnat and swallowing a camel. I mean, they've missed the whole point of God, what God intended. And he's going to put that on them in chapter 23. So you, like Mike says, it's pretty difficult. The Pharisees weren't very lovable, it didn't seem like. Mike?
We struggle with loving everybody, but if we can pull it off, it'll be pretty cool. In heaven, where he says, when I was hungry, you fed me, and all that. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was sick, you came to help me, and all that stuff. And a lot of that we may end up doing. People like they said, Mary said, we don't really like.
Yeah.
But we need to love them.
Well, you know what?
People don't like us.
Yeah. Like the old song said, what the world needs now is love, sweet love. We've heard that, and that's true, but it's biblical love, the kind of love that God talks about, that the world doesn't really grasp hold of very well, does it? I think a really good study, I'd like to study 1 Corinthians 13, the love chapter, really defines what agape love is all about. It gives us this ideal that's contrary to what most of us do, but that's a great definition of love there in that chapter. Appreciate the comments. Other thoughts or comments, Glenda?
Can you imagine when Paul's teaching these Jewish and Gentile Christians, and he's sharing this with them, the joy and the weight that they feel lifted off their shoulders, because they've been under, the Jewish people have been under that law, so many laws that
It's burdened them down so much.
And now it's boiled down to two.
Yeah. You get this right, all these others, Glenda talked about, can you imagine the weight that could be lifted off the Christian's shoulders that have been burdened with these laws? And then find out that it boils down to two. If you get love right, now we're going to look further. It doesn't say that he's done away with living right and other commandments. Love gives us the motivation to do the things that God's told us to do. But you get this right, you've done all these other things. And that's what, again, in Matthew 23, Jesus is going to talk about those burdens that the Pharisees had loaded on the people to keep all this right, and said, you put heavy burdens on them that you can't even bear. It's what he says in chapter 23 of Matthew. So yeah, they were so burdened down, and it's got to be a release. And that's why they talk about the law of Christ as liberty. It's freedom. And we don't understand that from the sense they did, because they were burdened down with law. We've been living under grace and love our whole lives, but they were burdened down. So yeah, I think it has a real concept to them that we probably don't get that concept as much, Glenda. So I appreciate you bringing that up. So I think that's a really good, excellent point. Other thoughts or comments?
Randy, could you say that Christ liberated people?
He did. Yes, he did. He liberated people. Yeah, that's a great point. And that's what Paul's tried to say in Romans, that we're not under law, we're under grace. And he expounds on that in Galatians as well. Freedom in Christ. And that's why when we get this concept that sin burdens you down, these laws they had burdened them down. And through Christ, we have liberty. And that's a great aspect of what he said. So verse 10, he continues with this idea, kind of what we've already talked about. Love does no wrong to a neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law. So someone who says where love is, the things which the law forbids do not occur. There is no longer anything for the law to condemn. And a lot of you have already characterized that. Bill said that too. If you love somebody, you're not going to do these things against them. So if we love the way we're supposed to, we're not going to murder, we're not going to steal, we're not going to commit adultery on our spouse if we truly love them, because we're committed and the things that love has to do with. He says, so we understand, we see the concept there, how it fulfills law. And God, let me share this with you. Many say, and this is where we want to be careful with, many say the only law is love, okay? And an aspect there is, but they're saying that they're free from all biblical commandments regarding doctrine and morality. That as long as I love, I'm okay. That's kind of what the world teaches. And so what Paul's concept is, Paul's purpose is not to dispense with every God-given law, but he's letting us know that love is what motivates us to follow God. Love is what motivates us to do God's will. And so we understand love doesn't toss away all our morality and that we can just do whatever we want to do as long as we're loving, because it just gives us the motivation to do what God said. John 15:12, Jesus said, this is my commandment, that you love one another just as I've loved you. So Paul continues to repeat that. Mike?
Well, an atheist can love his neighbor. And so.
Exactly.
That's not all there is to it. It's like you said, it's a motivation for Christians.
It's a motivation for Christians. And it's interesting, Paul is quoted as inspired apostle. It's quoted words of Jesus. 1 John 3:11, John writes, John is considered, if you study John in the New Testament, and he is one of the sons of thunder. He had this disposition. If you read in the New Testament, they wanted to call down fire from heaven. He and his brother did when people didn't receive him. Remember that conversation? He didn't come across as maybe the apostle you might think of love, but John is considered the apostle of love. In 1 John, you read through 1 John, it's all about love. I've heard writers from early on write about John and said, if someone had a problem, they came to John, John would say, just love one another. He'd say, if they had another problem, they'd come to John and he'd say, just love one another. He becomes the apostle of love. And you read through it. I just shared this one passage, but 1 John's full of his discussion about love. For this is the message which you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. John was there with Jesus. John heard Jesus talking about this. John saw Jesus display that in his life. And you see the transformation that takes over John's life, that he becomes what they refer to as the apostle of love. It transforms his life. And he goes about telling us to remember that and to love. So here's that aspect. Jesus said, if you love me, you'll keep my commandments, okay? So it's the motivation. This kind of love out of obligation we can never repay to God, leads us to do what he's told us to do. And I think I have another, here in James 1:12, let's look at this passage. Blessed is a man, James, brother Jesus writes, blessed is a man who perseveres under trial, for once he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Okay, so Jesus is saying love fulfills the law. What can the scriptures tell us? All we got to do is love God, because real love for God will lead us to do what? To obey him, to follow him. So it's not contrary to other scriptures to say that he'll give life, the crown of life, to all those he has promised to those who love him, because true love for God is going to follow what God says. So that's the concept that's in scripture. It's our motivation to do what God's told us. Someone said, God gave people laws to teach them how a loving person behaves toward God and others. Therefore, when a person learns to love, he is fulfilling that vital purpose of God's law. I like how that's written. Paul did not say that love is the end of the law. He didn't say it ends all law. He said it fulfills the law. It completes the law. It gives us motivation to keep what God has told us to do with our lives. So I think that's a really important distinction to make in what Paul is telling us. We'll close there this morning. Any final thoughts or comments? Just a few passages, but you see how powerful they are, and how it's interesting to see how Paul, as an inspired writer, says so many things directly from what Jesus had said that we want to be mindful of. Comments. Next week, Lord willing, I wrote down page numbers for next week. If you're reading along with Truth for Today, would be pages 322 to 328, and we'll pick up here in Romans chapter 13. Thanks for all your good comments this morning.
Good morning, wife.